Hi everyone. Well, we're on to Module 4. We're making good progress through the course. Last week in Module 3 we looked at power and inequality and its various manifestations, such as organizational crime. And I think one of the things we discovered is that there's a kind of deviant elite, and sometimes they're backed by organizational forces that make it more difficult to apply deviant labels than would be the case to someone who's not possessed of significant social status, not backed by an organization. And political corruption is a good example of that. So we had a chance to look at that. We also had, I believe, an interesting discussion about terrorism and the idea that terrorism is relative. And I think our book went through some of that, and we discussed it on the discussion board, especially the case of the Boston Tea Party. And the opinions were somewhat split on that, but most of you felt that the Boston Tea Party was not an act of terrorism, largely because you saw it as an act of patriotism. Of course, that's conflating the act itself with the motivation, because I think what you'll find if you look at terrorism is that groups that perpetrate terrorism believe that they're doing it for a good cause. They believe they're doing it for patriotic reasons or religious reasons that are legitimate reasons. So very often, whether something's regarded as terrorism or patriotism depends on what side you're on. So this week, we move into Module 4, and we'll be looking at mental illness. And I think what you'll find interesting is some of the ways in which various forms of behavior become identified as mental illnesses. The process is not as straightforward as you might think, and I think our book does a very good job of illustrating how a lot of factors that really have nothing to do with illness per se go into labeling a behavior or a set of conditions as mental illness. And it's significant when this happens because it then triggers some social responses, including legal responses that would not be triggered if it wasn't determined to be an instance of mental illness. And we'll also look at how mental illness and its definitions are used to control people. Social control. And I think you're going to find that interesting and maybe to some extent eye-opening. We'll also be looking at the psychiatric profession and the role it plays in determining whether behavior that's not typical is somehow defective or representative of illness. The American Psychiatric Association has had enormous influence in deciding what kinds of behavior ought to be regarded as mental illness. And as an example of how that works, homosexuality up until the 1970s was defined as a mental disorder. In the early 1970s, I believe it was 1973, they reversed their position and they took it off the list of mental disorders. So of course today, the vast majority of people don't regard homosexuality as a mental disorder at all, rather simply a different orientation than the common heterosexual orientation. Anyway, we'll get into some of that in our reading and as well as in our discussion. At the end of this week, Module 4, we will be submitting your first paper, and I appreciate the hard work that you're investing in this first assignment. Make sure that you look at not only the assignment instructions carefully, but the grading rubric I provided as well as the checklist. I gave you a checklist to use to make sure that you haven't left anything out. The grading rubric is what I have to use in grading the paper, so you want to make sure to take a look at that. So the grading rubric and the checklist are tools that are really going to be helpful to you in going ahead and doing the best job you can on your paper. So I'm looking forward to reading these papers. I'm sure they're going to be very interesting. So that's it for now. As always, if you have any questions, you know how to get hold of me, and I check for messages every day of the week. So I hope you have a great week, and I look forward to connecting with you on the discussion board.